Hello to the Hello to the Cloud Foundry TOC meeting. Today we have October 18th, and the agenda is review action items from last week. We will have an update from the CF on Kubernetes working group provided by Giuseppe. I hope I got the pronunciations right. Okay.
Oh, that's perfect. That's much better than most people do. So.
Okay. Afterwards, we look into the PRs for review and have any other business. Okay, let's start with the actions from last week. We have two actions for Andy.
Yeah, one of them is done, one of them isn't. I was out ill most of last week, so that can carry over.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then we will leave. So the one which is done is about the Jamie RFC, the update from draft to accepted state, and we have the RFC for the branch protection. Yeah. Okay, we can start then with the update for the CF on Kubernetes working group.
I guess I should share my screen. Let's see. First of all, start it as a slideshow. Share screen. Okay. Do you see the slides?
Yes.
Fantastic. It's not like it's many slides. It's going to be relatively brief. There is a total number of 3 slides. One is the one you're looking at. The other one is this one, where I'm going to basically update on what happened since last time we talked about this working group. And then I have another slide about what we have planned for the future. Yeah, just to reintroduce myself, I'm Giuseppe. I'm one of the leads of the CF on K8s working group. The thing we pretty much exclusively work on is called Korifi, which is a re-implementation of the Cloud Foundry API on top of Kubernetes primitives. So it's basically a rewrite from scratch of CF using Kubernetes native, like custom resources. And I think last time we did an update, we were, I think, fresh of our very first release. Since then, we have had 3 releases. And given there's a Kubecon approaching, I think we're going to try hard to have a 4th release before or during the conference. Since then, we've done a whole bunch of things. So we have introduced basic task support, which wasn't there before. It's not complete task support. We don't support some of the most advanced features, but we do have basic functionality, so you can run tasks. We have removed a dependency, which was called the Hierarchical Namespace Controller, which we used to basically reproduce the kind of the Cloud Foundry's organ space hierarchy in Kubernetes. Since then, we've decided to replace that with our own implementation that behaves similarly, but is a lot leaner and with a lot fewer problems. Every namespace we create, because in Korifi, every CF organ space is basically translated into a Kubernetes namespace. That comes with the pod security standard annotations, which kind of guarantees users that basically every pod that will be running into any Cloud Foundry managed namespace obeys to the most restrictive pod security standard that Kubernetes provides. Another thing we did was we introduced a way to abstract how Korifi actually runs apps and tasks. So previously we were doing this using a dependency called Eirini, which in turn was coming from the CF for K8s efforts. And we basically replaced that with 2 new controllers, which we call the statefulset-runner and the job-taskrunner, which reconcile resources called AppWorkload and TaskWorkload, which basically abstract over the concept of a long-running app and a short-running task. And the purpose of this is to allow organizations and people to replace the way Korifi actually runs apps and tasks. So we provide these default implementations where like apps are run as stateful sets and tasks are run as jobs in Kubernetes, but this can be replaced with whatever one might like, as long as it fits the abstraction. And we've done a similar thing for builds. So Korifi uses Kpack for building, from going from sources to images, basically, but this is also abstracted. So that the mechanism that it gets used to build apps can be replaced as long as it's in the form of a controller that reconciles these bird workload resources. So that's been, I guess, the major effort since the last update. And then we have improved a lot the way we support manifests for apps that get pushed. Our first implementation of manifests was very simple, and it worked for like straightforward like CF push something commands, but it was lacking in a bunch of places, so we've kind of rewrote it, and it's now much better, although it's still not complete. One side effect of this is that now commands like cf push-m or cf push-i, all those top level flags, which we didn't used to support, are now supported. That's pretty much it. As I said, 0.4 should come out soon, hopefully this week or next week. And the main change in 0.4 is going to be we will finally have a Helm chart for the product. Until now, installation has been quite complicated. Our install instructions were like kind of involved, and it just wasn't easy to install the product. So it was possible, but like there were lots of manual steps. We hope that that's not the case anymore with this chart. So hopefully the installation process has now turned into pretty much a one-liner. There's still a bunch of dependencies to install, but when it comes to installing Korifi proper, it should just be one command. And for the future, I think in the past we've talked about how we planned to abstract the networking layer using the gateway API. So basically, Cloud Foundry has its own networking primitives. It has domains, routes, etc. And we currently reconcile those into Contour resources. So we're coupled to Contour. Our idea was, okay, we're going to decouple and allow people to use any networking solution they like via the gateway API, which is this new API that is going to eventually land in Kubernetes, and allows, which does exactly that. It abstracts the networking layer on any cluster. The problem is gateway API is not ready yet, and we don't know when it's going to be ready, and it feels like it might be a bit late. So what we're considering is basically introducing our own abstraction, which is effectively just the CF root abstraction, and just allow users to replace the reconciler for roots with their own implementation. And we currently have a pair of engineers from SAP exploring, for example, the implementation of that reconciler based on Istio versus our default Contour one. And once the gateway API is ready, we might just have an implementation of that reconciler, which reconciles to the gateway API resources, and eventually, I guess, migrate everything to that. But until then, we can still benefit from that kind of flexibility. One of the things we're missing from the gateway API is, for example, support for things like WebSockets and things like HTTP2. They just haven't nailed how they want to abstract that. And it's a bit of a blocker for us because currently in CF, if you push a WebSockets app, it will work out of the box. And it will be a bit of a shame to introduce such a regression. And also pretty much every network component that I've seen supports the gateway API either in alpha or in beta. Like there's no such thing as a stable gateway API implementation at the moment. Another thing that we've actually already started but is not done yet is support for annotations and labels. So CF has this concept of annotations and labels, which basically mirrors the Kubernetes equivalents pretty closely. So we plan to just support these everywhere so that every annotation and label applied via the Kubernetes, the CF API translates into the equivalent in K8s. Docker support, because despite running on Kubernetes, we still don't support Docker images, like CF push. We don't support CF pushing of Docker images. So that's something that should be relatively easy to do, but it still requires some work. I have a half-ready proposal out there, so that might be one of the next things we look at. And then when we kind of rewrote our manifest handling code, we realized we were only handling one app at a time. Not just one app at a time. We only handled one app. Like at the moment, we only, like when you push a manifest, we will only look at the first entry in the apps list, and there's no reason to do that. So one of the next things we'll do is probably just remove that limitation and allow people to push multiple apps with one manifest. So this is what I had in mind for the future. New things might come up, but this is at the moment what's like planned. So that's really it. If anyone has any questions, I'm very happy to answer. I see there is a chat thing. Oh, no, okay. It's just some cheering. Thanks.
Does it already support service brokers?
Sorry, say that again.
Are service brokers already supported? Or
no, like, that is actually a big one. We do support user-provided services, I think, but when it comes to brokers, I think it's still not clear to us which API and standard we should follow. So, for example, I think there is a Kubernetes service standard kind of taking shape, plus there is the old OSBAPI, and I think it's still unclear which direction we want to go. It's definitely one of the big things that we're missing, that it will be kind of, it requires some serious investigation, exploration before we can start working on it.
And another question: why was Helm chosen instead of Carvel? I mean, Helm is probably the standard, but I know that previous projects used Carvel.
We basically, what we considered was, yes, Carvel, but we also considered just customize, and then we considered Helm, and we did some experiments. And I think for our use case, Helm was just the easiest to use, the most like ergonomic tool. Our installation is currently just Helm install, like the URL of the tarball. You don't even have to download it. And then you just pass in your values and it gets installed, which is exactly what we needed. We didn't need a tool more powerful than that, but also we couldn't do with a tool less powerful than that. So I think Helm was just the right compromise. It's very popular in the community, and it seems to basically fit all our needs. So that's why we went with that. You're still free to, if you want to, for example, install using K-app or applying some K-building, you're still free to do it because Helm allows you to separate the templating phase from the installing phase. So I know some people kind of dislike the way Helm installs things. We chose Helm mostly for the way Helm templates things. So in that case, you just Helm template and then pipe it into your tool of choice for installation, for application. If you don't have any of particular use case, I think you can just Helm install and you'll be fine. But yeah, it was just,
Yeah,
I guess the reason, there's no particular reason we couldn't have used Carvel, but we liked Helm and how simple it is and how like it's a kind of ergonomics.
I think the problems with Helm come in at day 2, right? Like it's in day 2 operations that can be problematic, which I think that's why other people have used Carvel, KApp, right? That's trying to address some of those, like trying to upgrade your actual thing to the next version problem.
Yeah, I think what we plan to do is in those cases is leveraging hooks, and they should be enough. So Helm allows you basically to run stuff before and after the installation, and if you need to do any sort of migrating stuff around. But yeah, again, if you prefer to install with KApp, it's still feasible. You just Helm template and then pipe it into KApp, and you're good to go.
We have a question also in our chat. Are you planning to do any work in testing compatibility between CF on VMs and Korifi?
No, we're not doing anything in particular at the moment. One thing that I've been doing like by myself just to play is I've been trying to run K8s, and it's helped like surface things that are missing. And it still requires basically K8s to be heavily modified in order to have even just a few tests to pass. But I can see a future where like our surface grows and grows and grows to a point where like we should be able to run at least like a minimal subset of K8s. And once we get to that point, I think we should keep those in our pipelines just because it's extra validation that everything is working, and that we're not kind of introducing regressions, but also not deviating kind of from the other implementation. I think at the moment it's just too early. There's just too many things missing, and also it might not end up being K8s just because the K8s is very coupled to CF on VMs. The way it logs in, for example, is different, and it uses features that we might never want to introduce. Like, for example, it heavily uses quotas, and while we could implement quotas, it's not one of our highest priorities just because CF quotas don't necessarily, like exposing quotas via the CF API doesn't necessarily add out that much value versus just the operator introducing quotas directly via the Kubernetes API. So maybe the solution is to come up with a test suite that is more like implementation agnostic in a way. But it is a nice idea, like something that we could run against CF on VMs and Korifi just to make sure that there is some alignment. We never want it to be like identical. We want to be reasonably similar. So yeah, maybe K8s is not the best tool, but it's been fun to just trying to run it and be like, actually we're missing this, and that. It's a great way to see where the differences are and then decide which gaps we want to fill and which ones we
don't. Regarding walks, we have different ways to forward walks on CF or pull them via APIs. Do you have any plans here?
Honestly, I think at the moment what we do is we just pull logs from Kubernetes pods. So basically, I think Kubernetes has this very the Kubernetes approach to logs is they keep a few lines, and then if you want anything more sophisticated than that, you install your own thing. And I think we were going to pretty much stick to that philosophy. So like out of the box, the CF logs command and that kind of stuff will work showing you the same logs that Kubernetes would show you basically. But if you want anything more sophisticated, you should probably go for some Kubernetes specific solution that allows you to collect logs. And so I don't think we're going to reproduce anything like a I don't remember what is it called.
Syswalk drain or walk cache.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. We're not going to reproduce that. Kubernetes has analogous systems that do pretty much the same thing, but that's where like we depart from CF. Like I don't think we're going to support the same infrastructure. If anyone needs to collect logs properly, they can install something like I don't remember the name of that tool, but like there's a bunch I think that are capable of collecting and then redirecting.
But Giuseppe, thinking things like Fluent D or Fluent Bit. Okay. Yeah,
that's exactly that thing, and it has lots of like target systems it can send logs to, etc. But I think one of the problems we had with, for example, CF K8s is that in order to be very compatible with CF, we shipped dependencies, very heavy dependencies, which then were not very flexible and would not necessarily match what people wanted to run on their own clusters. So like, I don't think it makes sense for us to ship Fluent as a dependency. Instead, we're just going to tell people, we give you like minimal log support using what's available in Kubernetes vanilla. And then if you want to get fancy, you can get fancy. The cluster is yours, but you do it on the side of Korifi.
But none of those solutions are multi-tenant, right?
Sorry, say that again?
None of those solutions do multi-tenancy. Like
the log solutions, you mean?
Yeah, so you cannot like distinguish between different apps. Or I mean, you can probably distinguish, but you cannot have someone that logs in or has permissions in a certain space only see the logs from that certain space.
Well, I've never thought about the problem from that point of view. Like, in other words, what you're telling me is like in Fluent D, there is no way to give permission to people to see logs only for a namespace. So to mirror your Kubernetes permissions into your visibility of logs generated by pods running in those namespaces. Yeah, that is true. Honestly, if it's I wonder if this is a problem that people have like on Kubernetes outside of CF. Like, so again, I feel like this is one of those things where like we want to kind of delegate to the Kubernetes solution, whatever that is. The basic functionality, the basic log functionality, which will show you again logs stored by the kubelet, I guess, for the individual pods, will of course like work with the same permission model. But once those logs get sent off, of course, it's probably more complicated than that.
How far do you go with CF API compatibility and let's say completeness?
I don't know if there is any way. I don't think we've ever tried to measure that, but we have this document in our repository which tries to document which endpoints we support and which ones we don't. And I think we have quite a few groups of endpoints which we consider kind of pretty much covered. So you see, for example, so for example, for apps, we list every endpoint and specify which parameters we support, which we don't. So for example, here there are some differences. For example, here we don't support all query parameters. But for example, create builds, all parameters are supported, fully supported. There's a bunch of fully supported groups. Also, I guess there is it's tricky to look at a number because many endpoints in CF are either not used very, very frequently or are kind of weird, like esoteric, like not many people know they exist and are not necessarily useful. Like I rather care a lot about with the fact that the apps endpoints, for example, which are by far the most important ones, were supported versus others. And also even in this group of endpoints, like the things that we support is usually because like they get hit by the CLI in one way or the other. So like in the end, it might look like it's not a lot, but it's actually the endpoints that you probably hit like most of the times because those are the ones used by the CLI. I don't think we're not necessarily trying to achieve coverage at all costs. It's more like, impact versus cost. So I think like if we tried to support some groups of endpoints at all costs, it would take a lot of time, but like not many people would benefit from them. So it doesn't feel like worth doing.
Thanks.
And will it be possible to operate Korifi without exposing Kubernetes so to end user?
I think yes. There's some things leak. So for example, Korifi users are just Kubernetes users. So you would have to give the user a Kubernetes user, right? But basically Korifi doesn't have its own authentication / authorization system. It's the Kubernetes one. So when you're logging with first of all, when you're logging in, first you have to log in with a cluster using your whichever provider you use to log in. And then the CLI kind of piggybacks on that and accesses Korifi via the Kubernetes authentication, which also means like given every resource that you see here exposed via the CF API is also CRD in Kubernetes, the same permissions apply. So they could use the kubectl, but they would only have permission to the resources that belong to them because they are in namespaces, they are members of, etc. So we've kind of mapped CF permissions to Kubernetes permissions. So yeah, the answer is yes, you could, as long as they have a user, I think they'd be fine. But you can also just give them kubectl access and they will still have the same, they will be able to do exactly the same things they can do via the API and not much more, because we use Kubernetes RBAC. We don't add any sort of layer on top or anything like that. So our RBAC is Kubernetes' RBAC. Our authentication is Kubernetes' authentication. So we always consider that use case as well. We always think, okay, like basically something that is forbidden via the CF API will be forbidden via the Kubernetes API as well, and vice versa.
You support like CF create user yet? No,
and I will probably never support that, right? Because we don't have UAA and we don't want to have UAA. We want to delegate management of users to whichever user management the Kubernetes cluster is using. So if you want to create users, you have to create users that way. And even just logging in, as I said, what happens is you log in via your provider's provided flow, and there are all sorts of flows. We've seen, when we investigated this, we saw all sorts of stuff. And then once you're logged in, you'll have an entry in your Kubernetes config, which will contain either a token or the information needed to retrieve a token. And the CF CLI just uses that. So what you do when you do a CF, after targeting a Korifi, when you CF login, you just get presented with a list of user infos, that's what they're called, in your kube config, and you choose the one that you want to use and you go from there. So we don't actually, CF login on K8s doesn't actually log in. The actual authentication procedure, the retrieve, like the authentication and retrieval of the token, etc., has to happen outside. And the reason we went for this is that basically the Kubernetes configuration is the only thing that all providers have in common. Like every provider will log you in all sorts of very like creative ways. They all boil down to some kube config that has to be recognized by everyone because that's what kubectl uses. That's what the Go client uses, etc. So that's really the interface, right? So we decided, okay, we're gonna program against that interface, and it does mean that the whole authentication and author process is basically outside of CF.
Yeah, and then Giuseppe, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a partial reimplementation so far of some of the CF roles, right? So you can still do like CF set space role space developer.
Absolutely, yeah. So what we do, what we do is with limits, because like Kubernetes RBAC is not as fine-grained, I would say, as the CF one. We provide Kubernetes equivalents of at least some of the CF roles. So you can, once the user exists in Kubernetes, you can make them space managers or space developers, or so the roles that you're used to in CF are there. Maybe not all of them. We still haven't covered all of them, but they are there, and you can assign them to spaces and orgs, and they map to Kubernetes roles and role bindings. There's things like in Cloud Foundry is capable of saying, okay, if you have this role, I will conceal some fields from the JSON. That's not something that Kubernetes can do, so we don't do it. And I think here in the docs somewhere, yeah, there you go. We do tell you we won't be able to redact these fields. We could be doing this in Korifi when we generate the JSON. We could artificially redact this, but then if you are a kubectl user using the Kubernetes API directly, you still see it. So we decide to keep the two ways of accessing our resources equivalent, right? It would be just kind of, we wouldn't be concealing much because you could just hit the Kubernetes API directly and see it. So we just don't. And same for other things like, yeah, fields, we don't redact fields. Basically, that's the big difference. Other than that, you think inside the repository somewhere, you should be able to see our roles, and they're basically Kubernetes equivalents of, I wonder where they live, maybe here. Yeah, there you go. So for example, if you look at the CF space developer, this is a cluster role, and you see what you can do. So you can, I don't know, get, create, patch, delete, list, and watch apps inside if you are a space developer in that namespace. So basically, we are reproducing what the CF documentation does, but documentation says in here, basically.
In my world with CF, I accept that maybe my world is a little bit different for CF than many, because we're Heroku inside government. Well, we aren't in control of most things. We have departments come along and request an account, they get an account, we assign one or more admins of that account for them as the org owner, and after that they're free to do their own user management. We don't get involved. Is that something that would be possible under this model, or is it only cluster admins that are going to be able to do user management? Because that feels like a bit of a fuck cannon to me.
I guess the way you delegate user management would have to depend on like the way your cluster does user management, if you see what I mean. Right. I think Korifi just doesn't get involved at all in user management, which means like if you need, I don't know, org admins, how are they called, org managers, to be able to create users inside the org, then we won't be able to provide that. Okay, just because of the way you basically reuse the user base that the cluster provides. That doesn't mean that you can't have a similar hierarchy in your user management solution inside your cluster, right? So you can have but you want it won't map to CF orgs and spaces, so necessarily, right. Unless you find a way to map them to. Yeah. Because the other thing is, Korifi orgs and spaces are just Kubernetes namespaces. Yeah. So this is the equivalent. If there is a way in Kubernetes of saying, okay, I'm going to allow a user to create other users which can only act inside this namespace or this set of namespaces, yes, you can kind of do that. But other than that, Korifi doesn't get involved into user management at all. Okay, so we would have to build something for ourselves that sits over the top of it that allows the user something in all part. Right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's good to know. It's just a different take on it than I was expecting. I think I was expecting more like CF for VMs, I think. I agree it would have been nice, but the main problem is CF VMs has UAA and it's very coupled to UAA, and it knows how to talk to UAA, and it does everything via UAA. We could have run a UAA in here as well, but then it meant you would have CF users and Kubernetes users as separate entities. And then how do you allow people, how do you manage permissions? It means you have to implement your own RBAC basically on top of Kubernetes one. And that just felt wrong. So we were like, okay, we want to reuse Kubernetes RBAC. That means you have to reuse Kubernetes users. And it's like, okay, is there a standard way of managing users in Kubernetes via an API? Absolutely not. Is there even a standard way to log in Kubernetes? No. Like the closest thing is, what is it called? This extension of auth, the name of, I now forget, but like, is like
OIDC.
OIDC, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Not many. If you look on the market, I think Amazon is the only provider that will allow you to simply say, okay, I'm going to connect an OIDC provider to this cluster. I think Google has its own thing that looks a bit like OIDC, but isn't quite. And then Amazon, Azure has its own thing, Active Directory, whatever. And then who knows about the others? Like, it's completely wild in terms of like the variety and diversity of solutions is just unmanageable. So that means we kind of had to scale back and say, okay, we just can't do anything with users. It's just not. There's just not. No one has anything in common with anyone else. So there's just no way we could abstract over this, even if we wanted to. It would have been nice, but there's just no way.
This sounds like it. Yeah, community solution. I think I would imagine is what will end up happening, and probably for the right reasons ultimately, by the sounds of it.
I keep getting called by my dad, which I wasn't expecting, but I guess. How do I even avoid that? Can I?
If you hit focus,
boom.
Do not disturb.
Okay, sorry about that.
We're going to change it to an hour so that it turns off at some point.
Fine.
Another question I have is, did you have some thoughts about the scale you would like to support in one Korifi deployment?
There's been talks because I think common wisdom, what I've heard, is that Kubernetes clusters just can't get very big. That's what I've heard from people who have experience managing Kubernetes clusters. It looks like CF foundations actually are capable of getting much bigger than Kubernetes cluster can. I don't know whether that's still true or whether that has to be true forever, or I don't know.
It might be more of a question of like could versus should, you know?
Yeah, right. Yeah, because yeah, I guess they have a much more complex, I guess, architecture and model. So I get most of the talking has been about, oh, can we stretch beyond a single cluster? And there's been hypotheses of how we could do things like, I don't know, do we have like a master cluster where and then we spawn workloads on different other clusters, which are like do we have a leader and then we have clusters that are just for running workloads while like the brain is on one cluster. Or I don't know. There is some abstract. I think there is some tools that allow you to do that at the Kubernetes level. So like, can we rely on any of those and then install Korifi on top of those so that Korifi thinks it's running on one Kubernetes cluster, but it's actually many. There's challenges. We haven't really explored it too deeply. I think the day we want to solve it, there's going to be lots of research to do. Because, for example, I mean, let's say we go with the model I described first. That means you need controllers that talk to two different Kubernetes APIs at the same time, which is not really what most controllers are used to do. How do you it means you have to, because each cluster is stateful, has its own etcd, so like you have to keep state in sync, which feels like a bit nightmarish. So yeah, we have thought about it, but we don't have a solution in mind yet.
Yeah, I think some other patterns that we're seeing out there also in the wider community are using secondary repositories of state, like Git repositories, to coordinate resources between two clusters. So, you know, maybe that's an area where kind of those intermediate abstractions, like the workloads, can give room to let people try different patterns as they emerge in the Kubernetes community. And there's still that level of abstraction above that would translate into CF resources.
Yeah, because, for example, like I just described how we have this like resources that abstract the way the apps and tasks are run. One thing that one of those could do is reconcile a resource on cluster A into pods on cluster B, right? So maybe that's a way, and that would mean zero changes to Korifi's architecture. And so you have a cluster where all the state of all running apps sits, and then you have a bunch of clusters just run the apps. But like, I feel the more I think about it, the more things I come up that need solving. Like, how do you do all the networking stuff, and how do you make sure, like I've just talked about permissions and RBAC. How does that work across clusters? And like, I know there is tools to do, for example, single sign-on, so that you authenticate once and then you have a token that works on n clusters. That's good, but like still, what about permissions? Like, what about, like, we use the namespace hierarchy for RBAC. Do we need to reproduce that in other clusters? It becomes complex very quickly. There have been proposals about, we do one cluster per org, for example. But maybe that could work out, because then, you know, each cluster only has an org. So permission-wise, maybe it's easier.
According to the official Kubernetes docs, they say that they support up to 5,000 nodes now.
That's pretty big.
That's pretty big.
As long as Kubernetes is happy, I think we are happy. Like, I think we completely delegate when it comes to running stuff, etc. It's all delegated, right? So I know there is a number of, maybe a limit to the number of pods which the kubelet will accept per node, maybe.
Yeah,
but again,
if 110.
Yeah, that's the default. I think it's configurable too, so you could really crank it up if you want to.
I mean, in terms of overhead, we create a bunch of resources, but the pods are just you have one pod per app instance. So from that point of view, we're not different than Diego say, right? We don't. The overhead of Korifi has a few controllers and an API. The overhead is like 5 or 6 pods, maybe. That's it. So from that point of view, we are, I guess, as scalable as Kubernetes is at the moment.
Okay. We had a lot of questions, not much time left. Is there one last question?
Giuseppe, has this been good prep for Kubecon next week? Explaining all this stuff.
I won't be around for Kubecon.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. You're not.
But
you can't
there's
make
a bunch of us who will. So if you are at Kubecon, go and find them.
I have one final terrifically awkward question.
Okay, go on.
Do you have a production ready-ish timeline? I know it's not going to be this year, or probably not even next year, but do you have a feeling as a team, as a working group, when you think this might be ready for somebody to use it in anger?
Honestly, no. I don't think we've thought about it. We're thinking now about starting to stabilize our CRD-based APIs. So soon we might start to treat our CRDs not as a playground where like we add and remove fields at will, but like start treating them as more stable. But yeah, I don't think we've thought about a 1.0 and how that would have to look like in terms of how much APIs we want to support, how much behavior we want to support. I think at the moment we're concentrated on getting this thing in the hands of as many people as possible to use it and give us feedback. Like, to me, what I expect, the day we're going to decide, okay, this is 1.0 worthy, let's release 1.0, is when like a bunch of people are using it and they're like, you know what, this is actually fine, we might as well release 1.0. Then that's when we release 1.0. But like now we are struggling to get this in the hands of people to try and to give us feedback about which direction they would like this thing to develop, like which things they're missing the most from CF for VMs, how easy it is to use, to install, to manage, to operate. Like we're still at this level where like we run it locally all the time, we run the tests, but like experience tells me that our use cases, like people who are developing it, is so narrow, and I have very little clue of like how people will be using it. So like I want people to start play with it and give me feedback about, oh, you know what, this thing that is missing would be a completely deal breaker for me. Okay, we're gonna work on it. So the thing you brought up about users never crossed my mind even remotely. Like I was like, oh, fine. Like, I have no idea of how people, use like big CFs in Angular. Like I've been working on CF for a long time, but always on the wrong side, I guess. So, so yeah, that's priority. And I guess I hope at some point we're like at a point where we have a bunch of users who are using it for a bunch of workloads that they deem relatively important, and they can tell us it's been fine so far, and then we might feel confident to be like, okay, go.
Yeah, and I would say having been using it for demos and experimentation for a while, it's really now at the point where in the small, it just seems like CF. Like if you're a space developer and you're pushing apps and making routes and binding stuff. And so, apart from active service management not being there, but again, user provided services just give you a very nice workaround. And so I think it seems to me like we're at that milestone with the project where it's kind of ready for more exposure because it feels like CF push and it feels complete and natural now. Yeah,
I mean, I act as kind of the PM for the European side of the team, and I do lots of acceptance, and if it seems to work pretty smoothly. Like I deploy it and then I push, I scale, I do this, I do that, and it works fine most of the times. So yeah, I agree. We definitely in a stage where like people can definitely start playing with it and see how it goes.
So it will be much easier to install it now with 0.4.
Yeah, it should be, once you have the dependencies in, and we have a few dependencies, all of which are installed with one-liners mostly, right? So, but once you have the dependencies in, it should just be a helm install away, more or less, especially if you don't need particular customizations. So for example, you might want your KPAC to be set up in a fancy way, but if you don't care and let us set up KPAC for you, it's gonna be easy. Like you just specify a flag in the Helm chart, and KPAC gets set up for you. And same for like I think the domain or like certificates. There are things where like you might want to, jump in and do your own customizations for your own environment. But if you're happy, if you just want to play with it, it's gonna be quite easy. Especially if you want to play on kind. We have a dedicated guide for kind because we're concentrating on people experimenting with it locally. So it should be very easy to get it running on kind and play, which is a great thing versus like CF for VMs, which was a bit harder to get to set up locally. This thing, like you can literally have a full Kubernetes cluster in Docker containers, and then you can have Korifi on top of that, and it's containers all the way down, and everything is very lightweight and super easy to get started.
Okay, then the message is you're looking for feedback. It's much easier now to get it running. We will be with 0.
Yeah, that's the reason we prioritize that kind of work in the first place, because we wanted to make it easy for people to try it out. Yeah.
Okay, then thank you, Giuseppe. It was, I think we put you quite under pressure with all the questions.
No worries. I'm very chatty and we're always happy to chat about this stuff.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the update. And we can jump now to the next point to review the PRs. Maybe we can start from the bottom. The draft about the RFC for branch protection is not ready now for review. This is an open action item. This is 449. We had quite a lot of discussion in the I think in the PR. So we have a pushback regarding how many reviewers we want to have. So most of the comments are about to have one review, which will be enough.
Yeah, in my opinion, we should not make it too complicated and prefer, let's say, a initial working solution that set up the something in common, because that was the initial request. And if then additional requirements like SALSA, etc., come in, then we may extend or reconsider that in the future. I say it also because if this becomes a standard, then probably GitHub will have one or two more configuration options in this future, and that makes it easier. I noticed that with the rules to bypass these approver roles for bots and without having admin rights, that was not possible. I think half a year or 1 year back, and meanwhile there is such an option. So I would really start with a simple thing like bots are allowed to push directly. Everything else needs a PR, one approver, and go from there. That would be my proposal. That was so sort of the smallest, least constraint where everybody can agree on. I don't know. That would be my point of view on this.
Yeah, we probably need some logic that we don't set it up for groups with not enough approvers, right? Still want something where you actually cannot require approvers if there aren't enough people. For the really small working groups.
That would be an area where there's just one approver inside. Okay, then it becomes difficult because you cannot approve your own PRs, but otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, like, people are also concerned about like having too big of a percentage of the approvers that need to be there, right? So if it's say maybe with 2 or 3 person group requiring one approval, I mean, I don't know, like that there is like a lower limit of where you actually don't want to require approvals. Maybe. I mean, that's what I interpreted from the discussion.
So then more a configuration option, how many approvers, and that goes from 0 to whatever number makes sense for you.
But I mean, like, that could be something we automatically calculate based on the number of approvers, right? Otherwise, you would have to expose a configuration option.
But we don't want to go above 1, or so which is
it sounds like we don't want to go above 1.
0 or 1, yeah. Just to. Yeah. Okay. I'm also to have it simpler, and if we need to comply to some SALSA regulations later, we can change this as problem.
Yeah, I mean, actually, the SALSA regulations say that the author is also fine. Like, so actually 1 approval should be enough. But the problem is that once you get a PR that's not by an approver, right, then you actually should have 2 approvals. And I don't think there's an option to do that in GitHub. But as Stefan was saying, right, maybe in the future there will be a solution to that. So let's make it not too complex for now.
Yeah. Okay, it looks like we have an agreement here.
Yeah, I guess the RFC needs a little rework,
Yeah.
or a little bit rephrasing, and then we could go
And
from there.
And they added a comment that he will open into chat. Yeah. Okay, we are short on time. I think we don't have any other PR which needs our attention, or do you know about any? I don't see this in our list.
I think we can merge 456. That was the status and start date of RFC 0001. Small correction. And it's.
I'm going ahead and merging that right now.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Is there any other topic which we can discuss in 2 minutes? Okay, then we are done for today.
Oh, should we just cancel for next week because of CF
Exactly,
Day?
yeah.
Oh, yes.
That makes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Stick it in the notes.
I'll make the change on the calendar.
Thank you, Ram. Okay, then have a nice evening or day or morning, and see you on Cloud Foundry Summit.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
See you.
Catch you in a bit.